So this is I think this is going to be one of the more fun sessions. We have a fantastic panel. They're going to introduce themselves. But I just want to start by describing my problem, which is that we talk about this word hate in a way that's somewhat religious, somewhat political, and somewhat clinical. And I wanted to explore this idea that hate was a clinical experience. And so my friend Joanne and I were having a cup of coffee. I said, well, what do you think about this? And she says, that's bullshit. That's the way I remember it. And we proceeded to argue for a little bit, and then we both looked at each other and said, that's a great session. Stop, let's move on. So we got our business done, and now we're here a year later to talk about it with you as our judge and jury. So the question to me is, when these events happen, and we all know about these events, we had one on February 14th, we've had them here in Portland, we want to know, what is the cause? What is the origin of this action? Maybe it's rational, maybe it's irrational, but there's a driving, consistent force of hate. And so I found these smart people to come and discuss this, and that's really all I've got to say. I'll be involved in the conversation, but I want to just go through and let everybody introduce each other. We have a little script to go, but let's just start with introductions.
Thanks, Jason. I'm going to stand so I can see these folks over here because I'm blocked by the podium a little bit. But it's nice to have all five of us up here. My name's Jeff Howe. I'm the first assistant to District Attorney Rod Underhill. I've been a prosecutor my entire career, which is reaching 23 years as of August. And I've been involved in every kind of criminal prosecution one could imagine. In 2008, I was tasked with helping set up the first mental health court in Multnomah County. Myself, Judge Franz, Lane Borg from Metropolitan Public Defender, and a couple others. And we got that off the ground with Judge Dick Baldwin, and it went just great and is still thriving today. I'm so proud of the mental health court that we have. So my office obviously has a policy to deal with hate crimes, and as we see more, or at least they become more high profile, we refine it and we work it. It's an ongoing challenge, as we'll discuss here today. And if I can I make my disclaimer now? I'm the lead prosecutor on a very high profile case, the case involving the deaths of two people and the severe wounding of another on the MAX train last May. As the lead prosecutor, I'm not going to be able to say one single word about it. That's the ethical rule, and that's the advice I got from the Oregon State Bar. Thank goodness this is videotaped, and that I have several hundred witnesses here. So if I sit mute, it's not because I don't have opinions, it's because I'm legally prescribed from talking about it. Maybe in a year, or maybe 2 years, I'll be able to come back and talk some more about that. But I look forward to the discussion and to hearing from these very smart people next to me. Thank you very much.
My name is Dr. Cynthia Fowler, and I am a psychiatrist in the community. I have a private practice up in Northeast Portland. I'm here today because Jason asked that I come and talk a little bit from the medical perspective and the psychiatric perspective about the topic we're going to discuss.
Hi, my name is Mark Schorr. I'm a licensed professional counselor and certified addictions counselor. I worked for Cascadia. Well, before I worked for Cascadia Behavioral Health Care for many years, I was a reporter and covered a lot of crime and mental health and just all kinds of things related to that. Then I got my degree in counseling psychology and worked for Cascadia Behavioral Health Care for about 15, 16 years. Then I worked for a place called Portland DBT for about 8 or 9 years, and that's we're focused on personality disorder, impulsivity, self-destructive behaviors, things like that. And for the past close to 3 years, I've been working with 3 psychiatrists, a couple of nurse practitioners, and a few other clinicians at a place called Pacific Premier Group, where the lead doc is allowed to prescribe Suboxone, which is kind of an alternative to methadone. So a lot of dual diagnosis. My main work has been with trauma, depression, anxiety, and co-occurring addictions.
Good morning. I'm Joanne Hardesty, and I have a bazillion hats in this community. I currently serve as president of the NAACP Portland branch for identification purposes only. I also am on the board of Human Solutions that provides housing for low-income families in East Portland, and have had a long-time radio show on KBOO called Voices from the Edge. And I am thrilled to be here. And Jason and I have worked at least for the last 2 decades around police reform, and so it is a pleasure always to join Jason in anything. Thank you.
I'm Rabbi Ariel Stone. I was ordained about 27 years ago and have worked in Jerusalem, in Ukraine, in the Northeast, the Southeast, and then in Portland, Oregon, where I have been, with some interruptions, since 1996, privileged to serve the Jewish community in a variety of ways. At the present time, the rabbi of congregation Shir Tikvah, which is the only Jewish congregation on the east side. It's a very interesting thing that river does in terms of separating us out. I am also very proud to be a founder and leader of Portland's interfaith clergy resistance. If you see the purple vests downtown, that's us.
So, who would like to start? We want to talk about this issue of, do you have the plan? Oh, let's go. Who goes first? Joanne. Joanne. You're the one who started this. You're the one who's disagreeable. What's your position on this?
Well, when you and I first started having this conversation about whether or not hate is a mental health issue as compared to just a emotional reaction to things based on your own worldview, what I said is that we give people a get out of jail free card if we just pretend somehow it's a mental health issue, right? Because the reality is hate is learned behavior, right? Nobody is born hating anybody. No one just wakes up one day and decides, I don't like green people, so I'm never talking to green people again, right? Hate is a learned behavior. Hate is a process. And so I believe that in some cases, it's kind of ironic when you see that we've had so many incidents since the general election in 2016 of outright in-your-face hate take place. And when we hear people debated about whether or not, well, maybe, this person was suffering from these mental health issues. In my view, what that does is negate their responsibility for the harm that they've caused. And so, yes, may there be mental health issues, there may very well be, but that is separate from the fact that they have acted in a way that was dangerous and harmful based on their belief that somebody else doesn't deserve to exist because of what they look like, where they were born, who they love, right? And so for me, it is I get a little crazed when in some situations folks try to justify hateful behavior and say, well, they were sick. They just didn't know what they were doing. I don't believe that should ever be an excuse for being a racist, for being homophobic, for being xenophobic, just for spouting hate. And what I am fearful of is, especially since the November 2016 election, We see this play out every single day in the city of Portland. So you don't even have to go outside of the Portland's borders to see what happens. I mean, even for myself personally, as a old black woman, and I say that kindly, 60-year-old black woman, I have never in my life, up until after the November 2016 election, been fearful of walking anywhere in the city of Portland. I find myself today, when vehicles pull up close to me, tensing up, looking for my escape route, right? Not something I ever thought about. And I'm a child of the civil rights movement, right? But what I know is that it's coming from so many different places today. This hate, this hateful language, this hateful disregard for people because they exist. And it appears that we don't have people in positions of power that have been able to clearly articulate the difference between free speech and hate speech. In fact, I'm still waiting for our statewide elected leaders to sign on to a letter that they started last year that was supposed to publicly say that our state elected leaders affirm that they will not tolerate hate speech. It's still being worked on because we have people who are fearful of actually signing on to a letter that makes it clear that hate speech is not something that we accept in Portland. And so if it's playing out at that level, then can you imagine what's happening in school rooms across the city of Portland? What's happening on public transit lines across the city of Portland? And so if our leaders can't clearly articulate the difference, we, the community, have a very hard time doing that as well. And so I don't want to give anybody a pass for hateful behavior because they may or may not have some mental health issues. So that's where we started this conversation, and I'm so grateful to be here today. Thank you.
I agree. I certainly agree with the part about being a learned behavior. I think the only, if you look at the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is sort of the Bible for mental health clinicians, there is no such thing as hate as a diagnosis. One of the, of course, that's not an infallible document because, for example, at one time, homosexuality was considered a disease, alcoholism was not, and only combat veterans could get PTSD. So it definitely has evolved over time. I think the idea of it being a learned behavior and how it manifests, Darwin talked about hate, and he referred to it as a very strong dislike. And it's interesting, when something becomes hate, and certainly when people act on it, that's when it really, it's a problematic behavior. I mean, if I say I hate asparagus, there's nothing wrong with that. Some people may agree with me. If I then go try and burn down an asparagus farm, then clearly it's become a problematic behavior. When you look at things like racism and sexism and prejudice against people with different religions, that's where it's problematic when people begin to act on it. People can have all kinds of thoughts in their head, but when they begin to act on it, and the goal of society should be to move them towards seeing things better, which looks at issues like education, and looks at issues like creating more things where people can be with people who are different from them and see how similar they are to them. And that's a great equalizer in general. So just looking at this question of hate, looking at the behavior, where it starts to get fuzzy is if someone's hate is motivated by psychosis. Psychosis is where someone has a really different reality. So let's say I hate someone because I believe they've broken into my house, killed my dog, stolen my children, done this and done that. Then if we look at that hate and it's coming out of a different reality, that might be a mitigating factor. But if someone basically shares the same reality with other people, then hate is a learned behavior, and it's a learned behavior that cannot and should not be acted on. So that's my.
Mark, the question Joanne's bringing is about responsibility. Where does that begin and end in that continuum for you?
It's really difficult, and I think some of it gets into the legal question. I mean, if you look like Jeffrey Dahmer was a cannibal, necrophiliac murderer, but he was technically sane. So he was like a hateful, doing all kinds of very hateful things. So finding out is someone really responsible for their actions, assuming that they share the same reality with other people, I would say yes. But that's where, and this also gets into the whole tricky question of with gun laws and the idea that mental health clinicians are going to stem the tide of gun violence by doing accurate assessments on people. That's wonderful, but I can tell you, as someone who's been in the field for a long time, sometimes I'm not told the truth, which you may be shocked to hear. Or sometimes someone is, at one point they're quite rational and coherent and responsible, and then the next day they're not. I mean, a lot of people get forced into court, forced to take medications, are stable, and then they're dumped out on the street, and there's no resources for them to access, and then they stop taking their medications, and then they wind up recycling back through the system, and they do have a very different reality, a very scary reality. When someone, for example, has paranoid schizophrenia, it's a very scary world. Imagine the scariest dream you've ever had of persecution, and then living that dream. And yeah, you would be tempted to lash out at people. So it really, it's difficult to say at what point does someone sort of lose responsibility for their actions. But for me, if there's really no evidence of psychosis, then they're responsible for their actions.
I have notes. I can't see them if I stand up. It's a bitch getting old. That's true. לב בני האדם מלא רב, הוללות בלבכם, בחייכם ואחריו על המתים. Ecclesiastes 9:3. The human heart is full of evil and madness in life, and then you die. In Jewish experience, evil takes several forms. When those who do good live no better than those who do not, that is considered to be evil. In Kohelet's world, Ecclesiastes. Another form of evil is Hamas, the human behavior which caused the flood. There's another variety of evil, and Jews know it well. It takes the form of crusades, pogroms, blood libels, inquisitions, massacres, and genocide. Judaism does not identify a human being's state of being with her behavior, i.e., no human being is evil, but a human behavior can be evil. Jewish theology and Jewish law both explore the differentiation of malicious evil and what we would call evil affected by mental illness, what's called kavanah, or intention, and must be established. I quote a former Supreme Court judge of the state of Israel here. No person is criminally responsible for any act unless he did that act willfully. Willfulness is excluded by duress, a concept much wider in Jewish than in other systems of law. For the purpose of penal law, it can be roughly divided into 5 categories of duress: coercion, threats of death, including governmental decrees threatening criminal prosecution, torture, force majeure, including sickness and other happenings beyond one's control. And 5, mistakes of fact and unconsciousness. Among those specifically excluded by the category of duress are those found to be mentally ill. In one law code, the mentally ill are described as those who go around alone at night, stay overnight in cemeteries, tear their clothes, and lose everything they are given. It is irrelevant whether any causal connection can be established between the disease and the offense. Once insanity is shown, criminal responsibility is excluded. The Jewish approach, then, would be that while evil can be defined and insanity can be defined, the acts of the insane cannot be defined as evil in a way that would make them liable for criminal punishment. Hatred, sin'ah in Hebrew, is defined in Jewish tradition as overt or covert ill will. It is understood as a mental disposition. The great teacher Hillel in ancient days taught that the entire essence of God's will as the Jewish people understand it and codified in Jewish law is that you shall not do to another person that which is hateful to you. Jewish law commands that you must not hate another in your heart, but it's also written that a person's immoral acts can sever the relationship. In the case of a hopelessly wicked person, Jewish tradition states that one is obligated to hate that person and to avoid contact. So I think that's like the asparagus. The most vicious form of hatred is sinat chinam, baseless hatred. Hatred for no reason is considered so destructive that Jewish law considers it equal to murder. Yes, evil exists. Jewish tradition offers a few insights onto the reality of evil. Yetzer lev ha'adam ra min ne'orav from Genesis chapter 8. So it starts early. Human nature naturally includes evil. The knowledge of good and evil and the difference between them is essential to human agency. After you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, your eyes shall be opened and you shall be as gods, knowing the difference between good and evil. And finally, and here is the only hope I can offer, evil is not demonic. It is a natural part of the world we live in. It exists. There's nothing we can do to eradicate it any more than we can eradicate any other quality which is part of our lives and of our world. This is a note of hope to me, because think about it this way. If you can look at an evil person, sorry, I just contradicted myself, a person who's behaving in an evil way, a person who clearly needs to be punished, a person who clearly needs to be controlled or their actions controlled before they do any more harm. If you look at that person and you say, that person is nothing like me, that person is a demon out of hell, then you don't understand what makes them tick, and you'll never be able to overcome their evil. But if you can look at that person and say, that person and I are on the exact same human spectrum of human possibility, that person's more extreme than I am, but we're both human beings, then I've got your number. If I dig down deep enough and honestly enough, I'll be able to figure out what I need to do to keep the evil person in my midst from continuing to poison my community or the planet. But only when I own it can I effectively stop it.
Well, when Jason asked me to talk about this from a medical perspective, I had to think a lot about this, and I did a lot of research. And, you know, there's not a lot of research that specifically shows anything biological or physiological or markers or anything regarding hate. There just wasn't much out there, although people were definitely talking about it. I do know that when they went to revise the latest DSM, Number 5, that there were people who were pushing for extreme racism to be listed as a disorder. And the American Psychiatric Association resisted this simply around the issue of responsibility. And they're concerned that this might make it so that people, it minimizes personal responsibility and says that, oh, these certain people who are extremely racist, they engage in hate, they engage in violence, there's something wrong with their brain and they're sick. So they're not as responsible for their actions. But there would be no real biological basis for this hate. I do believe that hate is learned and that it is culture, and we have to remember where we live. You know, if we're talking specifically about the U.S., U.S. has a long history of hate and a long history of violence because of hate. I've been doing a lot of reading as a part of preparing to do anti-racism trainings, and it's shocking. If you go back and you look at history and you look at the lynchings that have occurred and the violence that has been, perpetuated, thousands of people going out and attacking parts of town with people of color or people of different, particularly people of color, particularly black people, and attacking them. Are all those thousands of people who are participating in those actions, are they all mentally ill? It's highly unlikely that that's the case. It's very likely that this is a mob sort of building, and also that there's a fundamental belief within this society that not only are certain people hated, but that there's an indifference to certain people, a sense that other people, certain groups, their feelings don't matter, what happens to them doesn't matter. They don't matter as much as a dominant society and the dominant culture. In addition, there's there's a lack of empathy and a devaluation of certain people, and I think those are also highly connected to hate. And whether someone acts in a racist way, an extreme racist way, I think is related to the culture in which they live. If you have, say in the 1920s, it was perfectly acceptable for everyone from the president on down to very directly be overtly racist, and so it makes sense that people would have this idea that certain groups are demonized and that would be accepted throughout society. But now it's much more underground, so I think we see it as being somehow unusual and abnormal. We kind of respond to it sometimes as if, oh my God, why is this happening? But we have to look at our history and see that this is not new. And this has happened in other countries. People have been isolated and marginalized for any number of reasons. And I believe that if it really is the culture of the society, that it's a very small step towards violence, and that there's a very thin line between those who hate and who are indifferent and those who actually act on that hate. And it's possible that someone who commits a hate crime may be mentally ill. That's possible. And that if they were in another place and they would find something else they would do that would be violent, they'd have another reason to act out violently. But I think when you have a culture of violence and a culture of hate and marginalization and racism, I think you're going to have these people who are just going to be extreme. Most of it, people will be in the middle, and then you're going to have people who are outliers, and I think that's just to be expected. And it shouldn't be surprising. And until we can change the fundamental structure of our society in terms of racism and othering and marginalizing people for whatever reason, I think we're going to continue to see these crimes. And I think the sort of noticing this increase, after the election of 45, I think it's sort of, that shows that it is something psychological, and that there was this sort of implicit kind of permission, like this is somehow more acceptable now, so we can act out a little bit more. And this is okay, and we're not going to be condemned maybe if we do this, so we can act on our fantasies and our thoughts because we've been given permission to do so. So I think it's definitely more psychological, and I think that people, unless they are, I would agree with Mark, unless they are really overtly psychotic and delusional, are responsible for their violent acts.
Did I tell you that it was a privilege to sit up here with these smart people? This is always a fascinating conversation. I'm a prosecutor. I look at these things through the lens of what happened, can I prove it? If I can, what should the result be in terms of a sanction, a punishment, or some sort of rehabilitation? That's the perspective that I bring to this. We have seen, I believe, if not an increase in the number of hate crimes, and I use that term a little bit loosely, and I'll get into that in a minute. We've seen an increase in the reporting of them to law enforcement and to my office. We've seen an increase in the reporting of them in the media. And to me, as hard as it is to hear those things, that's actually a good thing, because I've long believed throughout my career that most hate crimes go unreported, and that is not a good thing. Not just from my own job security, but because I want our citizens in Multnomah County to feel safe, to feel heard, and to know that their public officials will respond when they think that they've been harmed in some way. I want to talk about responsibility because that's a key issue whenever a case comes into my office. Can I prove it? And when we talk about responsibility, first off, is a person just not responsible for their actions? If a crime has been committed, we're going to look at that in terms of whether or not that person is guilty except for insanity. We still use that old terminology, and we still use old definitions for that. But to be sort of guilty except for insanity, a person has to meet one of two tests. Either they couldn't appreciate the criminality of their conduct, or they couldn't conform their actions to the law. Now, that's a narrow little band of people that come through the criminal justice system. And quite frankly, in my experience and my review of recent cases, we're not seeing people that perpetrate hate crimes availing themselves of that avenue of resolution of their case, guilty except for insanity. It's so narrow, it's so tight that it would be most perpetrators of hate crimes would be hard-pressed to find a learned psychologist that would support that type of claim. What I see more, and what Cynthia was just talking about was, and we talked about this in preparation for this, is I see this more as sort of a Venn diagram. You've got some folks that are mentally ill. You've got some folks that are horribly racist, that they learned their hateful behavior somewhere along the line. And sometimes when those two things overlap in the middle there, that's when we see the majority, I think, of the perpetrators of hate crimes. Interestingly, in doing my research to discuss this with you folks, I found that there's a void. There's not a lot of research, at least that has been published yet, that can inform me as a prosecutor, that can inform law enforcement officials about why hate crimes are occurring and what to do once you've established that a hate crime has occurred. The best document I found actually came out of the UK. It's a document entitled Causes and Motivations of Hate Crime by the UK Equality and Civil Rights Commission from 2016. It does a wonderful job of laying out sort of causes and effects of hate crimes, and it's available online, and I encourage folks to read it if they want to get a criminal law perspective on hate crimes. And I'm going to just say one more thing before I turn it back over to Jason, and then I hope that people are going to have a lot of questions, and I imagine that they will. Our hate crimes in Oregon, and again, that term is not really accurate. We have 2 laws on the books that specifically address actions by people toward other people because of their race, their creed, their national origin, their sexual orientation, or others. Intimidation in the 2nd degree, which is a misdemeanor, and intimidation in the 1st degree, which is a felony. An A misdemeanor and a C felony. And in order, if I'm acting alone and committing that crime, I can't do anything but commit an A misdemeanor. If I'm acting with other people, that makes it a felony. These laws need to be enhanced. They need to be updated. We need to start talking statewide about greater responsibility for these things, but we also need to talk about if someone is found to be responsible for these things, what are we going to do? We're moving in the criminal justice system away from a strict crime and punishment model, and that's a good thing. And we're starting to talk about once a person is adjudicated, what can we do to stop people from continuing their ways in terms of criminality? But I'm yet to see something that addresses what we can do to stop someone full of hate from continuing to hate. That's another conversation we need to have. Thank you.
So some questions from the audience, and I'm going to come down and bring the mic to you so you can be heard, because we're recording this and we want to hear every word. Sam.
Thank you. There's an approach that the five of you alluded to but didn't directly address, and I'd like you to consider it. And this approach, I read it on the internet, so it must be true. The approach is that hate is a secondary emotion, and that the primary emotion is disenfranchisement. Emotional, cultural, political, medical. And that the approach to treating hate is to go to the origin, not treating ignorance with education, but treating being ignored with listening. Does this approach have much credibility?
In response to your question, what I would say is, I think that we don't readily identify hate for being what it is. I think it's really hard to say that this person is acting in this way because they have racist tendencies, and this is why we're getting the outcome that we're getting. And so I think hate, I think the primary factor is fear. It is fear of people who look different than you. It is fear that these people are getting something that you aren't getting. It is fear that they're ahead of you in line and they shouldn't be. I think fear is the overall emotion that drives racial hatred and racially discriminatory actions and activities, right? And I think that we do a very poor job as a society of calling out the fear, right? I think if we addressed the fear more directly, we would have less festering hatred happening in our community. And so I would love to be able to figure out, how do we just call out fear where we hear it, where we see it, and actually address that so that we're not leading to that fear festering into hateful actions and activities.
I would add, I think the disenfranchisement can feed into the fear, that the scariness of it. There's a guy named Paul Ekman who's done a lot of studying of emotions, and one an emotion that people don't often think of as a primary emotion is disgust. And he refers to disgust as the emotion of genocide, in that disgust has an evolutionary benefit of kind of expelling a poison. And if you come to see other people as a poison or a toxic or a threat or whatever, it's natural to want to get rid of them, to hurt them. Another thing that we haven't really touched on, but I think bears relevance, and it bears relevance as far as disenfranchisement, is greed and other emotions. So, for example, with the Holocaust, where Jews had their, all their things stolen and taken over by other people. And we've had it here, where there's been, I think it was in Tacoma, where there was a raid on the Chinese community, and basically everything was sort of taken away by people, and that may have been motivated by fear of the Chinese, but it was also motivated by greed. And I mean, we can open a discussion talking about what's happened to the Native Americans, and that's another whole conversation, but that's...
Question in the rear.
Hi, my name's Dawn, and first I just want to say thank you so much for your guys' openness to this conversation and everything that you're contributing. And my question is kind of piggybacking off of this first one, and it's about kind of the trajectory of hate and where we think it's headed in this country. And the perspective that I bring on this is that if hatred is this learned behavior, do we also think empathy is a learned behavior that can help counteract that? And where I see there's a tension is that we're constantly in our phones, and we have algorithms on Google and Facebook that makes sure that we don't interact with people that think differently than us. And so empathy is kind of, if it's a learned thing that needs to be nurtured, and our society is not nurturing that piece of it, I really get worried about the trajectory of where we're headed. So
I'm happy to. One of the aspects of the problem that I've been intrigued by in terms of what's happening in the United States is that I think it has some connection to the slower and slower rate of maturation that we are willing to accept in our society of the average individual. Because it takes a grown-up to recognize that the person next to you is not a projection of you, but has their own actual lived experience that you might actually need to respect and make room for. So the fact that we are disconnected from each other gives us so few opportunities to have that mature behavior modeled for us. Community. Real, deep community is what is at risk. A guy named Robert Putnam wrote a book years ago called Bowling Alone. He was looking around for the title of his next research, or looking around for a topic, and realized more and more people were going bowling and less were joining bowling leagues. There are 3 forms of social capital that he developed in his thesis. There's the light level, where we all get together because we have one thing in common, like we want to pass a bond issue, or we're gathering around a candidate or something. And you become very close with these people, and you share meals and frustration and deadlines. And then after the thing's over, nobody ever sees each other again, because you don't really have anything holding you together. The second level is the PTA or your long-running book group or whatever it is that's actually gone on for years in your life. But how free do we feel to turn to that level of connection when we're in crisis? As a rabbi, it makes me completely nuts when someone in my congregation is dying of a brain tumor and the family is so private and so insular and so not wanting to bother. No, really, we can do this ourselves. What gave them the idea that that was a good idea? The deepest level of community, the only one that will save us, is the level where I can turn to you when I am in pain and I need to lean on you and be vulnerable with you, and I can trust you.
Just one comment I have with regard to the question of where is the empathy and are we teaching it, and I say this because oftentimes I'm asked questions, over a beer or something like that. Why are these crimes occurring? And I like to think that I have as much empathy as the next guy, and I like to try to figure out, why are certain crime rates rising? Why are these things happening? And I've always fallen back on something that I figured out, or I thought of about 10 years into my career. Most of the people that are committing the crimes that I see lack 2 things: impulse control and empathy. And if those 2 things can be steered back towards the middle, steered back into the right direction, we're going to see those numbers drop, because impulse control and empathy are 2 things that will bring it down. And I don't have the answer on how to teach those 2 things, and I'm sure that there's a lot of smarter people than me that can help answer that. But I think if we got even towards that point, even walked in that direction a little bit, it would go a long ways.
Can I jump in the head of the line and ask Mark, can empathy be taught?
To some people. So, for example, the idea of lack of empathy and strong impulsivity very often goes with personality disorders. And in those cases, it is very difficult for most of the personality. For example, like antisocial personality disorder. Basically, the most effective thing is getting people to see it's in their own self-interest to not commit a crime. But there has
John Kelly's strategy.
No comment. But it really, it is very difficult. I mean, one of the things, for example, Piaget, who's a very famous developmental psychologist, shows, and this relates to what the rabbi was saying, that at a certain age, kids can't see things from another person's perspective. And he has this basic experiment where you have an object here, and then you ask the person, could your mommy see that object? And the kid assumes yes, just because they can see it. At a certain point, they are able to put themselves into someone else's mind. But then enhancing that does require modeling of behavior from an early age of, oh, if you see someone hurt, you go over to help them as opposed to you laugh. Or you, if someone falls, drops $1 on the floor, do you return it to them, or do you tuck it into your pocket, or do you ignore it completely?
I'll make a quick comment on that as well. And I think probably to a certain extent you can teach empathy, but I think the exposure that people often segregate in groups of people that they know and who are similar to themselves, and so that fuels the fear, is that there somehow has to be a way for people to really be exposed to unfamiliar cultures and unfamiliar people. And I think if they can make those connections just on a basic level, they could probably have much more empathy and a lot more fear. And I think part of that is where our society is structured. Segregation is more the norm than it is, the exception. So as long as we're segregated into our own communities, a lot of people don't have contact with anyone day to day who's different than themselves. And I think we have that issue of schools, that's issue of where we live in our neighborhoods and how we plan our communities.
Question here. Oh. Let's get another question, if that's all right. We got a lot of people who want to ask questions.
So I think it feels good to talk about people who are racist or hateful as those other people. I don't think we spend a lot of time talking about ourselves as racist or hateful people. And I hazard a guess that if I were to ask anyone in this room if they were racist or hateful, that there wouldn't be any hands quickly shot up. I think it's easy to talk about empathy when we are saying that they need to empathize with us. I think it's a lot harder to say that we need to empathize with them, that maybe they haven't been as marginalized as some other people, as the people they're attacking, but they feel marginalized. And I guess my concern, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, is when we get into groups like this with really smart people and we spend the entire time talking about what they need to change, it feels like what we really should be doing, or at least doing more of, is talking about how we need to change. We need to be the bigger person, to understand that, yes, some of their beliefs are that they want to eliminate a certain type of person. They want to do awful things, but they're not as different from us as we would like to think. They have fears that maybe we can address. Maybe it just takes someone from our side to give them the benefit of the doubt. There's countless stories of people who were racists or KKK members or something, and they were just let into someone else's home in their lives. And after a few years, they said, I don't really identify with that anymore. I'm just wondering, what can we do to be part of the solution that isn't just throwing labels out or plans for the other side?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it's more comforting to be able to talk about them because we can keep ourselves at arm distance. But let me ask you this question. So we live in a city with a 6% African-American population, yet 44% of the gang stops every year are of African-American people. And if you believe the police, and gang activity happens between 12 and 24 years old. If you do the math, how many times do you think every 12 to 24-year-old African-American child is stopped, searched, and questioned on an annual basis in the city of Portland? Right? You don't even have to tell me what the number is, but you would imagine that we've stopped every one at least a few times, right? And so my question is, why aren't you challenging that data? Why do you just see that data and go, oh, how sad that African Americans are 44% of the gang stops, right? Racism grabs hold because good people accept data that makes no sense. And so, because we comfortably accept information that's given to us as, oh, that's just the way it's always been, the fact that African Americans are twice as likely to be stopped and searched, right? The fact that they are 35 times more likely to be charged and convicted of spitting on a sidewalk. I mean, I read this data and steam comes out of my head, but most good liberals in Portland Metro just go, oh, that's so sad, right? And so when you ask, so that's not the other side. That's good people who get the same information that I get, but interpret it as, well, that's just the way things are, right? And so when we were in the Obama years, right, where people could pretend that they were progressive, and because I voted for Obama and life was good, right? When we were in the Obama years, people didn't have to question themselves about where they stood on quote unquote progressive issues, right? But now we've moved into another era, right? Where 54% of white women voted for Trump, right? Even though throughout the entire election season, he was the most racist, sexist, homophobic person that anybody had ever seen on the national stage, right? And so it's not by accident that all of a sudden people filled with hate have been empowered, because you empowered them. You told them it was okay to hate people because of what they look like, where they were born, right, who they love. And in fact, we've rewarded that behavior. And so you're right. There's a lot of internal work that has to take place. But I think that we have become a very, very passive society, that we just accept information as presented to us, and we don't even question it, right? And just because the information is presented year in and year out, doesn't mean that it's accurate, doesn't mean that it's equitable, doesn't mean that it's fair. And so we have a lot of work to do, especially the people who think they got it going on and they think they're progressive and they think, you know, I treat everybody the same. Those folks have a lot of work to do. Quite frankly, I prefer racists because I know exactly where they stand, right? We don't waste time, right? And, you know, you don't like me because I'm black, cool, right? Is there something else we can work on? If not, I'm moving on, right? Right? You know, that's, for me, that's freeing. What's not freeing is trying to figure out whether or not you really are who you say you are, right? That your values really are true, that when it gets tough, that you really, really are going to stand up for people who are being marginalized, right? For people who are being discriminated against. And I have to say, many of our public policies continue to discriminate against people based on race, based on economic status, and most people are perfectly fine with that, right? I have a problem with that.
We have another question in the back. Cynthia, why don't you go ahead?
I just want to make a quick comment about what the gentleman said about how do you deal with people who are, who are extremely hateful. And I think I would agree, they tend to be marginalized. They do need to be sort of brought more in to a discussion and to experiences with other people who don't feel that way. But the question is, who does that? Like, if we're talking about racism, I know that it's not people of color's responsibility to do that. It's not for us to do that. It really is for white people to sort of, in general, look within themselves and learn and educate themselves about racism, and then for white people to bring those extreme people of the dominant culture into the conversations with them. I see that as something that white people should and need to do as part of the solution.
Thank you all for your time today. I was just, in part of this conversation, I was really grateful to hear the perspective of evil as and kind of an inherent in our system, that this is something that we live in as a natural kind of course of order. And I was wondering if there was any sort of a perspective you could offer on the role of restorative justice approaches to these kinds of things. I feel like we live in a time or in a culture where frequently we move to other people by saying, oh, this is the villain in this, so let's just villainize that person, rather than trying to find approaches that that are more restorative. So in terms of this question, just if you have an answer, and thank you.
In the ancient world, there were no jails. Did you ever stop to think about where we came up with the idea that jail is an appropriate punishment? It's crazy, right? So in a nomadic society, you can't have jail because we're moving. I mean, what are you going to do, make a jail tent? So restorative justice is actually a much more ancient concept. In Jewish law, what you do depends on how much restoration. Very often, if the thing can be recovered, you just have to pay back another fifth or 2/5. If there's been damage to the object, then there's even more restoration, because the idea is that if you have to pay, I don't know, interest, you have to pay extra in kind or in currency, whatever you've got, then that in itself becomes a deterrent, but it's a useful deterrent. We need everybody to be working to save the planet. We can't afford to keep all these people behind bars, right? That's not doing anybody any good. In Jewish tradition, there's a mystical aspect that I particularly love because it's subversive and it pushes the envelope. And Jewish mysticism teaches that evil exists in the world because of harsh and excessive judgment.
Jason, if I can just say one thing about restorative justice, and I really appreciate that question. And as I mentioned when I first spoke, that your criminal justice system, our criminal justice system, is in a slow evolutionary process. And I'm thinking about what we're doing right now is we're nibbling around the edges of restorative justice, and we have some little pockets where people can sit down with their offender, and people can, at least come to an understanding of each other, the victimized and the offender. And my hope, and I know my boss's hope, is that we continue down that path. And I'm part of a group of prosecutors nationwide that is funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and Multnomah County is a participant in the MacArthur Foundation's Safety and Justice Challenge. And one thing that I learned about in December was what they're doing in Tucson, Arizona. And who would have thought that Tucson, Arizona is a hotbed of sort of progressive criminal justice reform? I didn't know until I got down there. But it's a very simple concept. It's a community restoration board. It's people that get together in neighborhoods and talk about low-level crimes. And we've tried things like that here. But they've taken it a step further, and they've made it the norm down there. And they spoke about it with such pride. But what that took was not just the police chief, the district attorney, the mayor, the county chair. That takes people at the very grassroots level to say, I do want to get involved in restorative justice efforts. And that takes people like us and people that aren't in this room to do that. So thank you for that question, and I'm encouraged even by the question.
Thank you. I also want to join and admire the panel for taking on this difficult conversation and facilitating it. You're doing a way better job than I expected. I wanted to follow up on something Rabbi Stone said a minute ago, and we talked about empathy, but it seems to me that hatred emerges when there's a void of compassion. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
So there's a view of the world which suggests that each one of us is a microcosm of the greater reality around us, and that the greater reality around us replicates itself in ways that are like fractal, that everything is an echo of everything else. And at the heart of everything is a balance, North Pole to South Pole, whatever you want to call it, in which both sides are necessary and equal in order to achieve a balance. This is something you can express in physics and in chemistry and in human life. It seems to be a truth that echoes on many levels. So there is, as I said before, there is evil and good in the world from forever. We don't know why, but one of the things we have to do when we grow up is put down the why and start saying, well, how am I going to deal with it? Okay, why is just sort of mental masturbation at some point. You got to just put it down and deal. Okay, there is. So let's deal. What's the smart way? What's the way with integrity? What's the way that brings together all aspects of our lives and the balance we need to achieve? One half of that balance is named compassion. No, wait, sorry. Bang. One half of that balance is named mercy. Love, mercy, the overflowing of I love, and the power of that love. The other side of that balance is called judgment, restraint, withholding. In a healthy system, you have an overflowing and you have limits. Everybody knows that you need boundaries that are healthy if you're going to survive and be in relationship. But we know that too much or too little is a problem, so you have to work on your boundaries. And on the other side of that, if you are an overflowing font of love and mercy and giving and everywhere you go, it becomes like that Monty Python skit where the kid is trying to help the little old lady across the street, but she doesn't want to go. All right? You have to like pay attention to how the mercy is needed so that you don't drown everybody. In the middle of that, in the balance of that, and here's why I love Jewish mysticism, the balance of the middle of that is not a neutrality. The balance, the necessary balance between judgment and mercy, between restraint and overflowing, between boundaries and absolutely endless love. The middle of that system, where the wisdom is found, is compassion. Compassion has to be a blend of careful judgment and mercy and love. It is the hardest quality of all of them because you have to use both your brains and your heart.
I have a question.
Hold on a second.
Hold on, he's bringing a mic. He's got it.
I apologize, Ted.
No problem. I have a concern regarding hate in our public school systems, the democratic values that we are supposed to be learning. In recent years, we see lack of funding. We see a bifurcation between public and private schools, and now private schools and more homeschoolings. We're not getting that integrated approach where students and families are all relating to one another and growing up with one another according to a core system of shared values, democratic values. Is that a possible reason why we see more hate? Instead of a melting pot, we've become melting pots, all siloed.
I think there's an illusion that we were a melting pot. We've never been a melting pot, right? I think we spend a lot of time trying to describe how we value the diversity that's within our communities. Today, the biggest challenge with schools is whether or not a young person can spend an entire school year in the same school. With the rising costs and rents, you may have seen the Sunday Oregonian that really clearly articulated how we've got kids that can't even finish one school year in the same school. They're going to 2-3 schools because we're pushing people out to the edges of our communities, right? Because they can't afford to live in a city center. I think that we have always lived isolated lives. I don't think that we've ever, as a country, been as inclusive as we pretend we've been, right? We talk a very good game. Even today, equity is the big buzzword. Equity means absolutely nothing, right? The word itself means nothing. All it is replacing affirmative action, equity, inclusion. I mean, every 10 years we have a new buzzword. But for me, I look at outcomes, and to live in a progressive society where the outcomes haven't changed in communities of color for over 30 years of quote-unquote progressive leadership tells me we still don't get it. And what we don't get is that we have built-in inequities in our system. So whether it's the education system, whether it's the healthcare system, whether it's the home ownership system, you look across the board at all the social determinants of health, And unfortunately, the data hasn't changed much in 30 years, right? What we know is Native Americans are still at the very bottom of every social determinant of health. African Americans are right on top of them, and Latinos are right on top of them, right? I think that we have to get more comfortable with being uncomfortable with the reality of who we are. Because if we never address who we really are, not who we want to be, not who we think we are, but who we really are, then we will never get to the real solutions. And the reality is that Oregon was built as a white supremacist state. It built into its systems white supremacy principles, and most of those principles still play out in every government institution today. Now, we don't have Klan members, self-identified Klan members leading anything today, but their systems that they put in place are still, white Oregonians are still reaping the benefits of those systems. And so until we honestly and openly look at, across the board, all these systems and figure out, is this a remnant of our white supremacist past? And if it is, how do we fix it, right? And how do we really get to that quote-unquote beloved community where we really are valuing all the voices? I've lived here for almost 30 years, hasn't happened yet, but I'm hopeful that it might happen, right? It might happen when we start having real conversations where we move through the discomfort, because that's the only place that change happens. But I have found in the Pacific Northwest that we have this disease called politeitis, right? And we bend over backwards, making sure that we don't make people uncomfortable, which means, guess what? We don't ever really change anything fundamentally because people will be uncomfortable, and heaven forbid that.
Hi there, I'm Erin Barker. I'm over here, hi. I think this is a great topic because this is something I think about a lot. I think about hate a lot, and I think about empathy a lot because I have a neurological disorder called misophonia, which affords me an abnormally high degree of empathy, but it also affords me a lot of hate because misophonia, what it means is hatred of sound. And so this neurological disorder, what happens when there's a sound that triggers my disorder, my fight or flight response is invoked. And so I've had to figure out ways to cope with that. And the way that I think is the best way to go about dealing with hatred and behaviors is to use the psychological ABCs, which is affect, behavior, and cognition. And I think that what we're doing here is ascribing hate to behavior, which is appropriate to say that behaviors of hate are inappropriate. But I think that we can also look at ascribing hate to affect and cognition and figure out when hate is applied to our feelings, how can we mitigate that and cope with that without hurting anybody else? So I'm wondering if we can use that as a system of approach to coping and moving forward with how we understand the problem.
Sure. I mean, I think anything, one of the things, you know, there's just been studies, for example, about cognition and thought, and the fact that very often, like, very primary and primal emotions come up almost without thought, like a trauma reaction. So someone just has an instinctive gut feel. I got that way when I were to hear George Bush's voice. I got that way now when I hear it. It's just, he could be saying something I 100% agree with, but my fight or flight is firing. So it is really different. I think we have to really address it in every way possible. And cognitions are nice, but sometimes they're slower than emotions. That emotions really do come first. So working on that, and that goes back to, you know, what we've talked about, that it just has to start so early on. What is being exposed to people who are different from you, and then having positive relationships modeled in interaction with those people is just part of that initial wiring that we get, that we don't see people necessarily as other. Because that really is, that's a big part of that learned behavior. There was a famous old experiment way back when they could do questionable ethical things, where this teacher divided up her class and taught people that, people who have blue eyes are cool, and people who have brown eyes are, they're those people. And by the end of the class, the kids were on board with that. And the kids with brown eyes were feeling inferior. The kids with blue eyes were clearly superior. And, like the old song, you've got to be carefully taught. It's true.
Hi. Go ahead.
A quick follow-up in terms of we're getting into interesting territory about the other. And one of the things that's so difficult in our society, to me, is summed up by a marvelous cartoon that Gary Larson did years ago, where you may have seen it on a coffee cup. There's a sea of penguins, and one penguin is standing up and yelling, "I gotta be me," or maybe it was the Adidas commercial, which tried to convince us that if 200 million people buy the same sneaker, it will let you be a unique individual, right? So we do some funny things in our society. We market individuality that everybody needs to conform to. And we talk about needing to see the other in a way that is just like us, but we also need to develop a real ability to tolerate the fact that people are not us, right? So how do I learn to celebrate the fact, distinguish difference, and see it as a glorious diversity? If I love hummingbirds, but if every bird out there was a hummingbird, I'd get bored, right? So why is this so much harder? Why is there so much fear involved? Rather than just, look how cool. I seem to recall in the Lewis and Clark expedition, when the natives came upon York, they're like, dude, what'd you do to your skin? Right? It wasn't a negative. It was a, whoa, check it out. That's cool. But we are so worried about actually being different from each other and therefore having different opinions that we can't tolerate, that when I got my Jewish group together with a Christian group once, just to explore differences and learn from them, every single table reported back after lunch that, we were delighted by how much we found we have in common.
Hi, my name is Morgan. To kind of take off on that, I started working as the psychiatrist for the jails in Multnomah County about a year ago. And I think it's been very interesting for me as a person to talk with people and see, there's this one thing in life where if I had done it differently or they had done it differently, we could be in the other person's spot. But my question is, so my eyes have been open to all of these things that I never recognized were an issue growing up in a very small white town in Iowa. And I find myself very upset about them. So we talk about making noise and doing all of these things. Where do I go to do that? And how do we make the noise so that something actually happens? Because I can yell in my office about it all I want, but that's not fixing anything.
What a great question, and thank you for the work you do. Way back in the day when I worked for Multnomah County, the best mental health treatment in the city of Portland was in the Multnomah County jails. I don't know if that is true today, but thank you for what you do. It's absolutely necessary. So how do you make noise? You join a group like the one that's putting on this conference today. Collective action is what changes a system. As an individual, I can feel the frustration because you're right. You can complain and complain and complain. I try to get myself invited to tables where decision makers are actually changing policy. When I can't do that, I organize advocacy groups to put pressure on the people that were at the table to make the changes that we want to see happen. But it is always important that you bring other people along, right? People who are observing, people who have graduated from your program. There's nothing like people giving their lived experience at legislative hearings and in front of the Multnomah County Commission board meetings and at the city council. It's important that those voices are heard. And I just want to say, I got to tell you, if you're looking for a quick response, nothing moves quick. And when you're trying to change public policy, or if you're trying to make it better, but consistent advocacy with people inside who are committed to the change, as well as people outside that are pushing the envelope, is the only thing that ever changes government institutions. So again, thank you for what you do. Know that you are not by yourself. There are lots of organizations that are working to make those changes happen, and I would just say you would be one of those experts that could come and provide expert testimony to one of those organizations or join one and help make it better.
Yeah, I agree with Joanne that joining an organization is important, and I also think it's important to educate yourself to understand the system, because a lot of people don't see the actual systemic quality of what is actually going on. That's more significant than actually these extreme acts of hate that we're seeing. It's the system that really supports that and makes those acts possible. So you want to educate yourself, and also the people around you, to start talking to your family and your friends. These are hard conversations. My partner, who's white, his family, it's been 2.5 years, and he's been trying to have the discussion, and they're still pushing back, right? They won't talk about it. So it's a hard conversation to have, but if you can do that, you can educate yourself and bring other people along with you, join organizations, because we really need a mass of people. We need the majority of people to be on board, understanding what's happening in order to make these changes. It can't be a small group of people like it has largely been.
We have one last question here.
I'm sorry, I've struggled with how I wanted to word this for quite some time here. I came from an interesting background, a very, very conservative Christian, only associated with like types growing up. And also came from a military family, so I went off and joined the Army when I came of age. And of course, in the global war on terror era, combined with conservative Christian background, the great evil in the world that was taught to me was Islam. And I don't know why I was fortunate enough when I actually got overseas to realize, hey, these people aren't any different than us. There's as many different schools of thought in Islam as there are in Christianity or any other religion. So that was actually a positive experience for me. An issue that I see amongst other people, particularly of an older generation, is the question of indoctrination. And it's this idea that by exposing young children to diversity, they're somehow brainwashing. And that's, I mean, I hear it from, I'll put it this way, people that I was exposed to in my past, that by exposing children to a more diverse environment, which I personally feel is helpful, it's something that can nip such extreme hatred in the bud. How do you respond to people like that?
So I grew up with a father from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, who at a time when the chance of a black boy growing into a black man was pretty slim. He was taught at an early age, you don't interact with white folks at all, right? If you have to work with them, fine, you work with them, and then you go home. My mom, on the other hand, born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, was a very light complexion, and many of her sisters could pass for white. But my mom's philosophy was, you treat people the way you want to be treated. And all people are good, basically, by blah, 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 right? So I grew up in a household where these very two extreme viewpoints were presented right smack dab in the middle of the civil rights movement, right? And so I was a kid that asked a lot of why questions. Well, why are they beating up people? Because they're trying to register to vote. Well, why are those people having dogs sicked on them? Because they're trying to get an education. My mom and dad's lived experience growing up were as different as night and day. But what they taught us as a household was that you treat people the way you want to be treated. I think the value of kindergartners and pre-kindergartners hanging out together is the most fabulous thing on the planet, right? Because kids at that age, they really, 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 really don't see color, right? So when you get to be our age and you talk about, I'm colorblind, that's BS, right? But for kids, they know what real color blindness is, right? Because they will hug and love up on another child just because that child's there. I think that we teach kids how to see differences, because they certainly aren't born seeing those differences. We, their parents, their influencers, their aunties, their uncles are the ones that are pointing out those differences. And so we start that separation process from a very young age. I think we should, we should just mandate that all 2-year-olds and under, right, are required to spend 8 hours a day together with each other, right? I don't know what the answer is, right, to create that beloved community. But what I know is the earlier you start, nobody can change that for you, right? Because you will know what you know. So if you start at a year old valuing people because of how cool they look, because they look different than you, they talk different, right? They dance different. If you start that at a young age, you're not going to lose that. Nobody's going to be able to tell you once you get in school, oh, well, don't talk to that person because, their hair looks weird, right? Because you've already built that up. Unfortunately, again, we're not living in communities that is as multiracial as they should be, because we are, in fact, resegregating America in a way that is going to be damaging both short-term and long-term. So I'm pretty sure I didn't answer your question, but that's the best I could do.
So point, counterpoint a little bit, I guess. I'm here to talk again about how healthy communities are important. So one person's indoctrination is another person's rich cultural community, right? So who are you to tell me how to raise my child? Who are you to tell me not to pass on my values? Who are you to tell me not to bring my gun to church and wear a crown of bullets? That was really amazing. Who are you to tell me that's not religion, right? So how do we parse a society that values diverse expression to the extent that we don't know where relativity becomes actually a false god? Okay, so who am I to judge you? One person's treasure is another person's trash. All of those idioms that we have that basically say, leave me alone. We're all libertarians in the United States on that level, right? I have the right to do what I want in my space. I am the king or queen or whatever of my space. When we have no solid ground upon which we all can agree, then it's very difficult to know where healthy boundaries around a community, around a person, around a behavior have fallen over a line into something that's actually dangerous to them and to other living beings. Part of what's so difficult about this conversation is that here's a really difficult thing in my line of work. There's no such thing as a valid generalization. In Jewish law, it is written that any judge that decides a case based solely on precedent has abdicated their responsibility, because every single situation is new. Every single situation has to carry as much regard for the context as for the precedent. You can never make a true generalization, including that one. Right? So some people believe, philosophers believe, that the root problem that we are facing in the modern era is that we don't have a God that we all salute. Some of us worship capitalism, some of us worship socialism, some of us worship whatever, but ever since the Reformation, we don't have a single ground of meaning. Philosophers have bent themselves into pretzels trying to come up with a ground of ethics that isn't relative. And no one's done it yet, at least not, and kept me awake. If you think about it, the only good grounding for us all to agree on is that somebody that no one can reproach said so. And we don't live in that world.
We need to close. I'm sorry, there's lunch going on. Buffet lunch, everybody. I don't want you to be at the end of the line. Thank you. Let's thank these folks. 5 of the smartest people in Portland.